Great. So welcome to Wisdom in Nature's online forum this Saturday morning, UK time, where we're kind of going into beyond COP26, and the kind of theme is regenerative structures for a new society. So just for the recording, I'm Muzammil. I'm a member of Wisdom in Nature. And the specific sort of focus is titled Inspired by Meeting Revolutionary Peasants, the Zapatistas from Mexico, and a kind of Muslim perspective and then wider sharing in the group. And I'm going to start just by saying a little bit about the Zapatistas, because some people may not have any familiarity about them. And Shumesta and Valentina will add more in their parts. And then I'll also say a little bit about our own journey as to why this theme of regenerative structures, what's kind of motivated us, and the why I feel is really important. Why are we doing something? You know, what's the meaning for us behind this, and to keep that intention alive. And each of you may have your why and a deeper why as well. So I want to invite you to kind of really tune in to your why also. So just in a nutshell, I first heard about the Zapatistas around 2004, shortly after I moved to Brighton from London, and I was reading a book. In fact, it's here by Paul Kingsnorth, which is One No Many Yeses, which is a fascinating book of different kind of, you know, revolutionary movements and inspiring kind of activisms happening around the world. And I think, yeah, Paul Kingsnorth, he used to be, I think, a kind of maybe deputy editor of the Ecologist, and he's doing stuff that is quite different now, but someone who researched stuff really well. And the first chapter is actually on the Zapatistas, and it really kind of is gripping the way he wrote that. And I know the Zapatistas are mentioned in other places that I've come across, and but not in a lot of detail. So since then, when I've come across them, it's kind of, I've had a kind of reference point, and I've always like then taken note. And they came into kind of global consciousness in 1994, on the 1st of January 1994, when the North American Free Trade Agreement came into force. And what that would mean, and I'm really summarizing, is that it would lead to devastation. You know, they're indigenous, they work on the land, and growing corn is a major part of the work that they've been doing for generations. Land is absolutely crucial to them, and the North American Free Trade Agreement would absolutely hit their work. It would lead to cheap imports coming in from the United States, of very small varieties, and their diversity of corn that they were producing would be damaged, livelihoods and so on would be absolutely devastated. And there's a long history to this as well. And there's also something about a particular article that was giving them some guarantee of ownership over the land that had been revoked. And that, along with NAFTA, was a huge sort of hit. So just at the time when NAFTA was coming in, there was an insurgence, and they took over a number of villages, and basically, you know, kind of declared that these were not under government control. And they did have weapons, and some of them were wooden weapons, but they knew that they would be attacked, and they needed to also defend themselves. So just to kind of also bring that into awareness of what their challenges were. And since then, there were autonomous villages that are self-governed, direct democracy, that came out of this insurgence. And there's a few dozen of them that still exist as autonomous communities. So how many years later? That's sort of almost 30 years later, these villages exist under direct democracy as autonomous villages. So a little bit about our journey. What's got us interested in this topic of regenerative structures? So in Wisdom in Nature, we've always been interested in how we do things, because how we do things and how we structure ourselves is a model for what we're creating. We may not get to the end that we seek, but in the process, we're actually creating something. We're forming something by coming together. We're making decisions. What's the form of decision making that we're using? So something is forming that's like almost like a kind of community. Um, but also with real community, there are needs, to be met. So I want to highlight that as well, that autonomous community is more than just people coming together. It's about needs being met. And that I'm assuming Shmes or Valentina may touch on more. So this has been part of our ethos about process, about what we're co-creating, co-cultivating. At the same time, we're in a world where, for me, there's some good stuff happening and there's crises. There's no doubt there's crises that gives us sort of time boundness as well, particularly the climate crises, but they're interlinked, I believe. So we're at a time of crises that is based on structures and processes that are pathological, that are degenerative, that are contributing to the crises, and that are also unsustainable, which means that they're not going to last. And yet we also are interwoven in them and depend on them. So whatever form of activism we're doing, climate justice or whatever, there's an absolute need to build new regenerative structures in order to create models of what we need in the world now that hold the qualities, that hold the resonance. There's no plan as to how we get to a regenerative world that I believe anyone has that will work. And in that there's room, I feel, for a bigger intelligence, that we can only focus on what we have power over. And the quality of ihsan in Islam, excellence and beauty, bringing that into the work. And some of the qualities people mentioned, something that came up as Valentina mentioned, was accountability and the many other qualities that we can hold, and to create the structures, the processes that, and I think Seth may have mentioned connecting communities up. There's connections that can form. So we don't need to have to worry what others are doing, but we can really just focus on what we can do within our power. Because we need to create wholesome healing structures, and just because we need healing, and also because the existing ones, the cracks have already shown at times of crises in different parts of the world. The pandemic, there was major cracks at the beginning. It's not a resilient system. Hurricane Katrina, in the States, is a kind of like classical example, depended on grassroots radical organizing that meant that those particularly who were less privileged, that their needs, medical care and so on, was met. So that's kind of when I'm fired up, is really to explore this, and that it takes a number of people to be really passionate, to have commitment, I think came up as well, as one of the qualities. So and discipline and so on, in order to make this journey and move forward. And some of the places of inspiration, because there are groups that are experimenting, that are really serious about this work. There are, on a small scale, radical housing cooperatives of just people living together and trying to live together in a more direct form of democracy. And they succeed to varying degrees. And the degree to which they're even direct democracy is massively variable. There's always hidden power dynamics as well. So we need to also be conscious of power and recognize that it is there, and it will be disproportionate at times. Some people have charisma, some people have a gender advantage, and so forth, that in society we have a perception of, and it affects us. So there's a need to kind of really work with these things in a conscious way. So there is radical cooperatives, there are autonomous communities like the Zapatistas, like in Rojava in northern Syria, the Kurdish movement there. There are eco-villages as well, and an interest, so these are some of the things we want to be exploring. And on eco-villages, there's a lot of inspiration I found in them as well. I'm also aware of the class issue and how accommodating they may be or not for those who can't afford housing. That's not to take away the inspiration, but I'd like to keep in consciousness, and also the time of the Prophet Muhammad, where community was about taking care of those who were less privileged. That was really the basis for me of a kind, in the social sense, of the origin of Islam, was taking care of those who had less, who were on the margins. And that was the basis for community there. That was the work, was taking care of society, of others in society. And interesting, there's a parallel between, I feel, the early days of Islam and the Zapatista movement, where community formed in the context of being physically oppressed and being attacked militarily. So that I want to kind of leave on that note. And I think maybe just to frame that we had a meeting, as you may have seen in the blurb, with the Zapatistas, with a bunch of other groups as well in early November. So just about a month ago, almost to the day, I think today. And that's something that will be covered as well. Something that moved us was that meeting, which we're really honored to have been part of. I'm going to hand over now to Shumesa, who will share a bit more about the Zapatistas.
Okay, so yeah, I'm just going to give a little bit of context, weaving together some of what from the day in the listening session I picked up, and also just what has been written about the Zapatistas in some context. So the Zapatistas can be considered many things: indigenous peasant movement, an anti-capitalist movement, among other things, and it originated in the state of Chiapas in Mexico. So that's the southernmost state of Mexico, and it's very rich in natural resources. But it also has, the highest multi-ethnic population amongst the, I think, 31 states of Mexico. But also very high levels of malnutrition, especially among the indigenous communities there, and also maternal mortality, land inequality, and so on. And so, I mean, that's quite striking, given that, for example, that it has a very sizable amount of fresh water, and that I think something like around 90% of the indigenous communities don't have access to piped water and plumbing and the meeting of their energy needs. And my understanding is that there was some, so Mexico as a whole, of course, was colonized by Spain about 500 years ago. And prior to that, they're under Aztec rule. And so there was a tradition of communal land use even throughout that time, and even after colonization, and then that, I think around like the mid 19th century, there were some changes by the government removing that communal system, and then there was like a struggle by the indigenous people. And so while there was some degree of communal land use by peasants, there was also simultaneously not the meeting of their needs, because, as evidenced by the poor health and various other things, illiteracy rates and things. So they all along for centuries, and the people, the delegation that we had the honor of listening to, spoke about their grandparents and their horrible treatment, but effectively kind of like an enslavement to the large plantation owners, and where there was forced child labor, violation of women by the plantation owners, just all kinds of horrific things that then there was many years of struggle peacefully, and that wasn't really resulting in any change, or there would be maybe some like modicum of improvement around maybe communal land use, but then it would be taken away. So the conclusion was that you can't, that whatever kind of some degree of progress can be made with government, it's never really goes deep enough, and then another government can come in and change it. So then there was a conscious decision, I think in the mid 1980s, to set up a guerrilla army, and we heard this directly from the delegation, that there was a small group of indigenous people in Chiapas who went to the mountains and focused on survival, and also they refer to this time as the clandestine time, about 9 years from beginning from the mid 80s, where they came back then from the mountains to the villages to dressed in different ways. So not at that point upfront about their kind of plans to develop and cultivate a kind of armed resistance and cultivate autonomy, but they were dressed up in kind of like as health workers and different things that would be relatable to the villagers, just to start listening to them and asking them questions about like what their thoughts were about the government and the way their societies were running. And so they kind of took on these appearances of health workers and teachers and etc., and started having conversations with villagers, and understood and heard kind of just distrust and disapproval of treatment and disillusionment, and over time kind of through those conversations gathered and recruited people both into their armed wing and also into a civilian supporter base. And then they decided, and then things like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, were coming, were going to happen, and other like the communal land aspects was being revoked. And so NAFTA was going to come into force in 1996, I think. And so they kind of symbolically at that time declared their war on the Mexican government. So the idea was, it wasn't just about their state, it was about, and the term they use, the Zapatistas, I think, National Army of Liberation. But at the time, they weren't able to get like widespread national involvement. But they did get in the state of Chiapas support and started to occupy land, large plantation lands, and basically effectively started to meet their needs autonomously. So they would recruit like people to support basic healthcare and develop education systems, and et cetera, and so forth and so on. And then eventually they did gain, through some struggle and loss of life, so as I said, it was armed initially, they gained some changes in the government. So globally recognized for their achievements for indigenous rights, and their critiques of neoliberalism and capitalism at that time. And what else do I want to say? I mean, there's just so much to say. I think, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time.
Yeah, you're doing okay. I mean, if you want to just round up on the Zapatistas bit and then lean into the event and our relationship with that. Did you want to do that?
Yeah, so I think I'll stop there. I mean, at the event itself, in relation to the Zapatistas, so they brought up a lot of principles that really resonated around not having the answer or the way, that we create the way by doing it, and that their governance is one of the government of their, what they consider their government or their governance doesn't make decisions. The people make decisions, and their governance form obeys the people. So it's kind of speaking to their disillusionment with governments in general. And they said something, I'll have to refer back to my notes about that, that governments, as virtually anywhere in the world, state governments are in one way or another captured. And so that again resonates with our stand around deep democracy. And it also is similar to the Kurdish movement in Rojava in northern Syria, that it's not like a paid class of government and governmentality where people are representing us, and that's how it is where we are in the UK and many other states, and making decisions for us. Whereas both in Rojava and in the Zapatista autonomous areas, there are people in a form of governance, but they're directly enacting decisions made by the people. But also, yeah, that they don't have the answer. And yeah, so they weren't, and not imposing, proposing and not imposing, and various other things that we picked up directly from the event. And maybe you can come back to that. But in terms of how WIN got involved, so that again comes back to our ethos, approach, and values. As I said, we've been experimenting, exploring, and trying to develop and practice less hierarchical ways of being and collectivism in how we are. And we don't say that we have the answers or the one way, and that we don't make mistakes, but that's what we try to, it's an important aspect of us. And also the just consciousness around funding. And then relationships. So I had developed a relationship and friendship with somebody in Brighton. We both used to work at a volunteer-run food cooperative at an unemployed family center, and also were involved, as was Muzamil, in a transition town movement many years ago. And that's how we met Joe, and we just have this mutual respect. Joe knows Stop Muslim. She's very now involved in the Kurdish Solidarity Movement and Solidarity Economics Association, among other things. And both Joe's activism and mine, and Wisdom in Natures, has changed and evolved over the time, but our core ethics and values have stayed in that way, in that vein. So Joe was among people who were attuned into this journey of life when it was announced around the 500-year anniversary of the colonization of Mexico. And so we were received the communication around this, and the idea to invite and sponsor the Zapatistas or fundraise for a crowdfund for the Zapatistas to come to Brighton as part of their visit to the Wise Isles. And yeah, so that's how Wisdom in Nature got involved. It comes down to our values, our ethos, and our relationship with people and groups who have similar ones. And then Muzamil in particular got involved in the organizing for the Zapatistas to come to Brighton, which didn't happen in that way, but because we were via Mzamo involved in that process, then we were invited to see them, visit with them in London. So I'll leave it, I think, at that.
Great, thank you, Shemessa. Yeah, there's a bit of luck involved as well, just being in the right place at the right time. And there's that. I'll just add a couple of things before Valentina can then come in. I noted some of the event itself in London was, yeah, there was translation, and I didn't pick up everything. But the government system they have there in the villages that are aligned to the Zapatistas, there was, I think, 7 principles. I got a few down. So Shemessa mentioned that the governance proposes, it doesn't impose. And one of the ones I really liked was that the people command and the government obeys. Also to convince and not to force, and to build and not to destroy. There's some of the ones. Oh, and to listen. There's maybe something more in that, but listening came in. And Shemessa touched on a journey for life, or journey of life, and I don't think we've explained it between us properly, that about, I think, over 160 Zapatistas, this has been planned for a while, came to Europe, and then they broke into delegations of 6 or 7. And there were 2 delegations that came to the Wise Isles, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, England. And we met up with one of the delegation of 6, I think it was. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to pass over to Valentina, who will say a bit more about the day and other stuff.
Well, thank you, Mzamo. Yeah, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm just going to speak a little bit about kind of the framework of the day in London. So I actually didn't know very much about the Zapatistas until I met Mzamo and Shemessa, and they were kind of mentioning some learnings and experiences over kind of the year and a bit that I've known them. And then, yeah, alhamdulillah, we were invited. Well, Wisdom in Nature was invited, and I got to tag along, which is very, very exciting, to this day in London, which was absolutely incredible. And as kind of Mzamo and Shemessa have mentioned, we had a delegation of Zapatistas come and, yeah, spend a day with different activist groups in London. And it was kind of a day based around co-learning, listening and sharing. And yeah, it was incredible. So the day was kind of structured. We arrived there, it was at one of the Kurdish Solidarity Centres in London. And there was lots of different groups kind of working in different areas, but all within kind of the social justice sphere. So there was like XR youth there, and there was a group assisting kind of migrant workers' rights and indigenous rights within environmental activism, and a group kind of taking legal action against the UK in regards to environmental issues. And it was just a huge range of like ages and experiences and cultures, and people coming from lots of different mindsets and experiences and upbringings. And it was just a really incredible, blessed space. And the day started with basically certain groups having a chance to speak and share with the delegation that met us about what they're doing and what they're struggling with and their experiences. And yeah, it was just such a blessing even just to be amongst these groups and hear, you know, people spoke with a lot of authenticity, and they spoke with a lot of you know, they spoke about what's going well, what's going hard, what the challenges are, what they're still struggling with. There was lots of really interesting conversations about kind of dynamics within groups and accountability within structures, which is something that Win focuses on a lot as well with the process work and the way Win try and look at activism as well, and how ensuring that how we are within our groups is a reflection of our intention as well, and not that we're echoing the structures we're trying to avoid and trying to remove ourselves from. And yeah, so it was kind of the morning of different groups sharing their experiences, and it was translated. So it was translated entirely from like Spanish to English, which also added a really interesting dynamic to the day, which meant that kind of every time a little bit was spoken, you had a moment to pause and absorb it. And initially I thought, oh gosh, it's gonna be really hard. It was, I don't know, I can't remember how long the day was. If it was from like 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., it was a whole day, and you know, after every kind of couple of sentences, you had to stop to translate it. But actually ended up being a very, very powerful tool to properly like reflect and process. And so many really powerful things were being shared, and you had the time to reflect and sit with it and be like, wow. Yeah, which doesn't happen all the time when things are moving so fast within different structures as well. And then we had a lovely lunch, and then the Zapatistas delegation had the chance to speak to us, which was just absolutely incredible. And it was, I think there was about 5 or 6 of them, and each person kind of took on a different role and spoke individually, which was really interesting as well. And within that, kind of there were different translators as well. Like the dynamics were really powerful. And yeah, I guess kind of like Shemes has mentioned, they spoke about their struggle, and a lot of like powerful and incredible messages came up. And yeah, that was kind of the framework of the day, just to give a bit of an explanation to it. And yeah, and then kind of leading from that, I wanted to share a little bit of like my experience of the event and how it affected me. And I think the most powerful thing within it was to be in a room where people are being authentic and sharing wisdom and are open to sharing challenges and struggles and sacrifice. And I mean, the Zapatista movement is just, I didn't know so much about it until I went there, and I just left like in complete awe of the sacrifice and the courage and the bravery of these individuals and these groups. And there was so much to like learn and take away from. And I remember we kind of came away, and on the bus there was just so many ideas coming about, and how can we utilize this, and how can we learn from it, and how can we put a lot of the stories and experiences that they shared into our own practices. And a part of it as well is really interesting, in which Mazamel mentioned briefly as well, is the kind of alignment with the Zapatista struggle, or social justice struggles, and and Islam as well. I'm studying at the moment a little bit like the Sirah, which is the biography of our Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and the way the community organized at the beginning of Islam, which was based pretty much entirely on social justice. And exactly as Mazamel kind of mentioned, like how do we uplift like minorities, how do we bring in all the voices, how do we support the oppressed? And it was very much initially like insular and focused on kind of community meeting their own needs, and how do we coexist and work within structures which are oppressive, and what can we do when kind of protests don't work and activism can only go so far. Like how do we organize ourselves and take accountability and take responsibility and meet the needs of our communities. And yeah, it was very, very powerful. And there were lots of learnings I took away from it as well. One of them being timing. There was a lot of interesting stories and experiences shared around timing, which the Zapatistas delegation shared about there being like the right moment to do certain things, and there being a moment to kind of stop and pause and reflect and process and learn, and then there's a moment for action. And I think, yeah, that was a very, very powerful lesson within it. It's kind of like knowing when it's time to kind of sit and think and plan and process, and when the time is to like step out, and when you're ready as a community as well. And there was also some interesting points as well on focusing on like commonalities and not getting distracted by like individualism and own personal goals, and actually the focus being solely on what is our intention as a community, and how do we push through and get this intention and these needs met, and not get distracted by all the other things that come about and all the things we bring forward as individuals as well. And yeah, it was an incredible day, and it was such a blessing to be invited and to hear not only from them but also from all the other groups about all the incredible things that are happening. And just a really big reminder as well of how important it is to hold spaces, to have these conversations and to learn from each other and to share and to, yeah, and to group, because the space itself just was so powerful, and so many interesting conversations within the breaks and within lunch, and yeah, just the importance of like holding these spaces and having these conversations and really thinking, because people are doing some incredible things on this earth and have always done, and how do we align ourselves to that? And I think this kind of forum itself, you know, we were thinking after kind of COP26, like how, okay, so people are protesting and it works to a certain extent, but then how do we actually, what are our other options? Like, how are people organizing themselves? How are communities forming? How is change actually coming about? And yeah, and the day was very powerful in opening up a lot of ideas for that, and inshallah, hopefully this is as well, and to kind of connect with everyone here who sounds incredible and is doing incredible things. And yeah, I think that's kind of my sharing. So that's that. I'll pass it back.
Excellent. Thank you, Valentina. Yeah, beautiful, both of you. I'm just going to chip in slightly before we open it. And there was also some guidelines for that the Zapatistas asked for, which kind of really shape, you know, sometimes before you even begin, what's the communication? I mean, we didn't directly communicate with them, but you know, there's about how we hold the space, which Valentina described a little bit. But they were bold in standing up for things that may have sounded unpopular if some of us may have said it in certain spaces. One of which was no recordings, no photographs, no filming. It was about serious talk, not about, you know, kind of splashing it on, you know, kind of Facebook as a kind of tick that box kind of thing. They also they weren't interested in big demonstrations where people then go off. Not that they aren't useful, but they wanted conversations where people are gathered and as groups that have come so that they can continue the work as their groups, rather than disperse without having that contact, so that work can take root. A couple of other things that were interesting just about, you know, is that I think this is correct to generalize this, but they don't drink. That's part of their community. They found alcohol to be disruptive to the formation of community, you know, and the same with recreational drugs. Shemessa, you want to chip in?
Yeah, just on that, I meant to say earlier, so many things to say, but yeah, so initially when the movement started, they were focused on the revolution and land justice and all of that. And at the time they started, there was a lot of violence against women in the area. And slowly as it developed and women became more a part of it, more and more, and took on more leadership and such, women advocated for the prohibition of alcohol in their communities, because they saw that as associated with the violence, domestic violence. And of course, keep in mind what I said earlier about the historical levels of horrific oppression. And so yeah, the women advocated for that ban in their communities. And yeah, that's just a little context. So eventually the gender issues within their own households and collectively became more embedded into their movement. That's where that came out of.
Great, yeah, wonderful, thanks. So I'm just going to touch on some of the qualities that were mentioned in the chat. So yeah, generosity. There was a real feeling of that quality within their organizing relationship, real care for one another, and a web of interactions. Yeah, in childcare, food. They talked about how they cared if somebody, you know, was struggling, then the community, that was a community issue, not just an individual issue. accountability, many layers, communities coming together, belonging, and welcome, to newcomers, support, reciprocity, mutualism, commitment. There was a huge commitment that they had, they really worked, they were describing how organizing the real dedication, a center, sort of space, a physical sort of space, and shared values, they have to be there. So, okay, so that's our talks, and I'm going to ask Valentina now to stop the recording, and then we'll continue.